A couple of weeks ago, I did a video on how to add reverb to Dolby Atmos objects in Cubase and or Nuendo. Back then, I used an external plugin, space recognition from Fiedler Audio, in order to create that reverb on the Dolby Atmos bed. And a couple of you have reached out to me asking, why are you doing it that complicated? There's actually a much easier way to do that. Now, I had my reasons why I did it the way I did it, but I have to admit that 99% of the time that is overkill. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you the most straightforward way to add reverb to Dolby Atmos objects in Cubase. So let's get started. But first of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I teach at the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And on this channel, I talk about digital media, game design, and spatial audio. And if any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join my Discord community. Invite link is in the description below. And since you already added, please also don't forget to press the like button, especially if you get any value out of my videos. It really helps out the channel, and I really appreciate it. Now what I'm going to show you today is actually fairly straightforward. So what I've decided to do is go through the Dolby Atmos setup one more time. So we're going to start pretty much from scratch, and we're going to turn a very simple project into a Dolby Atmos project. Now the project that I'm having here pretty much only contains one loop, that is a bass line. So let's just have a brief listen on that, how that sounds. So that's essentially what we're working with, very straightforward. And what we're going to do is we're going to set up a Dolby Atmos project, and we're going to use this baseline as a Dolby Atmos object that we're going to route into the Dolby Atmos renderer. And then we're going to add a reverb to that track that we're going to route into the Dolby Atmos bed. And that's really everything that we're going to do. And as we will see, this is actually very straightforward to do. So a couple of things we need to do. We need to first add a track that's going to hold the Dolby Atmos renderer. Now, if you are constantly working with Dolby Atmos, it makes sense to use the control room for that purpose. But if you're like somebody like me who sometimes works with Atmos, sometimes does not work with Atmos, it makes sense to just use a regular group track for that purpose. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add one group track that's going to hold the Dolby Atmos renderer. That needs to be a 7.1.4 track, and let's call that Atmos Bus. Let's add that. And then we're going to add a bed, and the bed has to be another group track that is a 7.1.2 track. So let's call that Atmos Bed. Okay, and let's just rearrange them for organizational purposes. And then I'm going to route the bass track into the Dolby Atmos bus. I recommend kind of routing all objects into the bus when you start out, simply because it makes it easier for Cubase and Nuendo to identify those tracks as something that you want to route into the Dolby Atmos renderer later. So always route that into the Dolby Atmos bus at the beginning. That kind of makes sure that there are no weird things going to happen. So we're going to do that. So I'm going to take the bass and I'm going to route that into the Dolby Atmos bus. Okay, now because of the routing, I should now still hear something. So if I'm playing the track, right, so it's now going through the Dolby Atmos bus. So the next thing I need to do is I need to add the Dolby Atmos render. The Dolby Atmos render lives on the Dolby Atmos bus. So let's just open up the inserts for the Dolby Atmos bus and add a renderer, or add the renderer. So let's add the Dolby Atmos renderer for Cubase. And kind of the renderer requires that you have a certain sample rate and a certain buffer size. If you don't have that, it will actually come up with an error. And some people have contacted me that they can't really get the renderer to work because of that reasons. Go back into the settings of your, if that happens to you, go back into the settings of your audio interface and make the changes accordingly. It has to have a very specific buffer size and a very specific sample rate in order for it to work. In my case, it works perfectly fine, so it didn't really come up with any errors. So the next thing I need to do is I need to tell Cubase that I actually want to use this as a Dolby Atmos project. So I'm going to go into the project settings, and under ADM authoring for Dolby Atmos, I need to make the appropriate changes. The first thing I need to do is I need to select which renderer that I'm using. Now I'm in Cubase, and in Cubase I only have one option, that is the internal renderer for Dolby Atmos. If you are in Nuendo, you have two options, the internal renderer and the external renderer. Please be sure that you use the renderer that you're actually using. If you're working with the internal renderer like I'm doing here, please select the internal renderer. If you're selecting the external renderer, it's not going to work. You need to choose that particular renderer that you're using. Now in my particular case, once again, I'm in Cubase. I only have one option, so let's select that. And then I need to add everything that I want to put into the Dolby Atmos object. So the first thing I'm going to add is I'm going to add a bed. And the bed is going to be the Atmos bed. And then I'm going to add one object, and I'm going to select the bass object. Now, in case your track does not show up here, that essentially means that there currently is no surround sound panel on that track. And that's actually the reason why I routed that track into the Dolby Atmos bus, to make sure that there's a surround sound panel on there. If it doesn't have a surround sound panel, then the authoring panel does not really know that this is a track that can be routed into the Dolby Atmos renderer. So if you have a track that doesn't show up here, go back into the settings of the track and make sure that it is routed into the bus so that it can actually be recognized by Cubase, and then you can select that in order to route that into the Dolby Atmos renderer. Now, in my case, I already did that, so I'm selecting the bass track, and that is my object. Now, as soon as I do that, you might have noticed that the bed has created this little rectangle here that is now clear that the renderer expects 10 channels on the bed. So this is 7.1.2, 10 channels. And we have selected the object IDs 11 and 12, so channels 11 and 12, and those are routed into channels 11 and 12 in the Dolby Atmos renderer. So if I now play that track again, I see that track now coming in as an object in through channels 11 and 12. And if I do any panning, and that's actually one of the things that a lot of people have a trouble understanding, the panning information now is sent separately into the renderer to the audio information. So if I'm doing any panning here, so let's open up the panner here on the bass track. So if I'm doing any panning here, you will actually see that the panning information is forwarded to the Dolby Atmos renderer. However, if I play that audio and I do any panning, you will actually see that the audio information that is coming in through channels 11 and 12 remains unchanged. And that is because in a Dolby Atmos project, the panning information and the audio information are sent separately into the renderer, and the actual renderer is happening at the rendering stage. So this is something a lot of people have trouble understanding. So the panning information that a panner doesn't really pan the audio signal. It just forwards the panning information to the renderer, who is then panning the audio signal. So let's just kind of reset that here. Sorry, so let's reset that here. And the next thing I'd like to do is I'd like to add a reverb. Now, if I would add a reverb to that track on the track itself, obviously then any panning that I would do would also pan the reverb. This is not what I want. I want the reverb actually be surrounding me, and that essentially means that I need to move the reverb into the Dolby Atmos bed. So this 7.1.2 track that sort of serves as the bed in which everything that is happening with the object is embedded in. That's why it's called the bed. Now, in my previous video, the way I did that is I used a separate plugin, Space-Lab Ignition from Fiedler Audio, in order to create that reverb. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to have the panning information be routed directly into the reverb plugin. This might be important if you're using a reverb plugin that is capable of calculating reflections in a three-dimensional space, because then you actually need the exact panning information in the plugin that is responsible for creating that reverb. However, as many of you have pointed out, that is overkill in 99% of the cases. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to simply route the signal into the bed, and then I'm going to add a reverb onto that signal. So let's do that. So the first thing I need to do is I need to route the audio that's coming out of the bass track into the Dolby Atmos bed so that I can then use it in order to create the reverb. So let's open up the channel settings and let's go into the Sense section of that channel. And what we're going to do is, it's already routed into the Dolby Atmos bus. We're going to route it in addition to that also into the Dolby Atmos bed. So we're going to open that up here, and under groups I should see the Dolby Atmos bed. So let's open that up and let's add that and let's enable that. And if I'm now playing the track, I should see that audio signal coming in on one hand in channels 11 and 12, because that's the object, those are the object channels, and it should also come in at channels 1 and 2, because that are left and right channel of the Dolby Atmos bed. So let's see if that's actually happening. And that's exactly what's happening. Now, one thing that's important to remember is that because of the way I've added this send function, I'm currently not really panning that audio signal that's going into the bed. So if I'm panning the audio signal of that particular track, so let's open up the panner and let's just play that again and let's pan it around a little. Essentially what I see is I see the panning going on in the Dolby Atmos renderer. I have the audio unchanged at 11 and 12 because that's the object channels, but I also have the audio unchanged at 1 and 2, so I have no panning going on. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that the audio or the panning that is done here in the panner of the bass track is also going to be applied to the send that goes into the Dolby Atmos bed. And that's actually something that is very, very easy to do. And it's something that I actually didn't know that it existed in Cubase. And that is we can actually link the panners of the send function. So let's go into the channel settings. And if you go into the channel settings, here we are, and if you go into the panning function and click on the individual channel settings, you will actually see here a kind of an item here that's called link panners. Now, if we select that, what will essentially happen is that the panner of the send will be replicated to match the panner of the original channel. So let's open up that again and play that again. And what's happening now is that as I'm moving the panner around, I actually see the object also panned into the Dolby Atmos bed. And that now allows me to actually simply add a reverb to that particular bed and kind of add the reverb that way. So last thing, let's just add a reverb. So we're going to go into the Dolby Atmos bed and we're going to add a reverb here. Now, the best reverb in this particular case would probably be a convolution reverb. I don't really have a convolution reverb here, so what I'm going to use is I'm going to use Lustrous Plates, a plate reverb from Liquid Sonics. And let's add that to our bed. And if I'm now playing that, I have the reverb very active here. So let's just reduce the audio a little. So let's go into the channel settings again, and let's in the sense, let's just kind of turn that down a little. And if I'm now changing the position of the object, we'll actually see that here. The input signal into the reverb will actually change accordingly, and I'm getting the correct impression or the correct reverb in my Dolby Atmos setup. So let's maybe turn it down a little more to make it a little bit more realistic. So let's go in here. Too many windows. Let's turn that down even more. Now I have a reverb to my object. So as you can see, this is very straightforward. All you really need to do is route the audio into the Dolby Atmos bed and then link the panners. So that's everything there is to it. Very straightforward, very simple. And that's really everything I wanted to say today. Thanks again for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section below or join my Discord community. And other than that, see you at the next video.